Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm just going to get things started off to here before I hand it off to Sindhu. Some housekeeping to know about this webinar. All participants are muted during this webinar. For technical issues, please use the chat function. Any questions can be submitted through the chat question box. A recording of this webinar will be sent out to the registration in 24 hours after the webinar has finished. We're going to head into the traditional land acknowledgement now. Eco-Canada and myself would like to recognize today and every day the land we are on. Eco-Canada is committed to reconciliation, starts with acknowledging and are honored and privileged to live and work within this Indigenous territory. Eco-Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and the oral practices of these Indigenous nations. So who is Eco-Canada? Eco-Canada is a steward of the environmental workforce across all industries. We champion the end-to-end career of an environmental professional. We not only train and certify professionals, but also help identify and address labor market gaps. Our efforts promote and drive responsible, sustainable economic growth to ensure that environmental care and best practices are our priority. Now I'm going to hand it off to Sindhu.
Hi Chase, could you confirm that the screen is visible and I'm audible?
Correct. Yep, you're good to go, Sindhu.
Hi everyone, thank you Chase. Welcome to the webinar on knowing about the GHG accounting. So this is one of the knowledge dissemination and awareness session which we are doing through a webinar under the project of called as calculating the emissions for small and medium businesses in Calgary. So this is funded by Alberta Eco Trust. So going further, so we will be discussing mostly on the climate change, impacts and causes. What is the GHG protocol? How do you classify scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions? Then how to identify the emission sources within your company or organization. So once you identify the sources, how to do the calculation. So how do you do the GHG accounting and also the inventorization part. So once we know the accounting and inventorization, we get the results of how much GHGs is being emitted. So from there, we would look at the mitigation strategies in order to reduce those emissions and some of the incentives offered by the government, so which we can avail and that could be used in our mitigation strategies, and what are the benefits from this, and finally a talk on our website which provides all this information. So before going ahead, I just want to know from you, so how many of you have come across climate change impacts or have faced any of them or heard of them, seen any of them? Can you just give in the chat box like any climate change impacts that you have come across? Okay, I think you would have heard many events such as wildfires and also hurricanes, floods, and all these are some of the impacts of climate change. So right now, the global challenge what we are facing is pollution and deforestation. And when we talk about this climate change impacts, we have to know what are the causes for that. So the causes would be mostly due to the pollution, deforestation, then no I mean ecological disturbance and to the biodiversity also. Now if you talk about what is the need of this hour in order to reduce the climate change impacts, is looking at the improving the efficiency with the available resources. So we all know about the definition of sustainability as well. So now the need of the hour is, with the available resources, we have to use them very efficiently such that we need not exploit the available resources, so which could be used by the future generations. So this means that pursuing green is a major business opportunity, and it also makes a business sense when you go green. When you are looking at the sustainability practices, from this presentation you will get to know that going towards the sustainability practices will help you in such a way that it creates a major business opportunity, and also it would make a business sense to you. So now talking about climate change, the definition of climate change. So it is given by a few organizations which work on this, which such as IPCC, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which says that any change in climate over time, uh, and the variability is due to the resultant is as a result of a human activity. So normally the climate change is occurring over the years, but however the human activity is actually enhancing the climate change impacts. So UNFCCC is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it also says that mostly the climate change happens, and however the human activity is enhancing the climate change, and there is a rapid global warming temperatures, and also precipitation change in the precipitation levels, etc. So now if we look at the greenhouse effect, so when we talk about a natural greenhouse effect, what happens here is the solar radiation from the sun, the light rays, heat and light rays falls on the surface of the earth. So some amount of it is absorbed by the earth's surface, and then the remaining is re-radiated into the atmosphere. Now once that is re-radiated and from the atmosphere, some of it is re-emitted into the earth's surface, to the atmosphere, and most of it escapes into the space. Now when this is the natural greenhouse effect. Now when we talk about the enhanced uh, greenhouse effect, here what happens is the phenomena is the same. So the solar radiation from sun reaches the earth's surface, and it is and most of it is absorbed by the earth, and the remaining is radiated into the atmosphere. Due to the presence of its greenhouse gases, what's happening is most of the heat is getting trapped in the earth's atmosphere, and very less heat is escaping into the space. So this is what we call it as human enhanced greenhouse effect. So when we talk about these greenhouse gases, why do we classify them under greenhouse gases is that they have the heat retention capacity. So that is one of the criteria for these gases to be classified under the greenhouse gases. Now if we talk about, is this greenhouse effect good or bad? So the natural greenhouse effect is a good effect. However, the human enhanced greenhouse effect is one of the causes for the impact of these climate changes happening. So if we think that this greenhouse effect or this phenomena is not at all there, the natural one also, it is said by scientists that the temperature on the earth's surface would be around -18, and we know how would it be. Now coming to the greenhouse gases. So there are 7 greenhouse gases which have been classified under the greenhouse gases based on their ability to trap the heat and their existence in the atmosphere for certain timeline. So when we take these greenhouse gases, so the first one is carbon dioxide. So it is the major quantity of gas which is present in the atmosphere, and it is emitted from the fossil fuel combustion, then from coal and crude oil, which are also the fossil fuels, during their extraction as well, and transportation. Now coming to methane. So methane is emitted from the agricultural processes, the natural gas systems, and also from the landfills. So that is one of the reason we say that most of the materials which are going into the landfill should be reduced in order to reduce the methane content. Now coming to N2O, it is nitrous oxide. So it is from the manufacturing processes and from the agricultural soil management. Now, if we talk about HFCs, so these are hydrofluorocarbons, which are substitute for ozone depleting substances, and it is also emitted during semiconductor manufacturing, and we use HFCs even in the refrigerator HVAC systems as well. Coming to the perfluorocarbons, it is from mostly from aluminium production. Then looking at SF6, SF6 is sulfur hexafluoride. So mostly it is present in the electrical transmission systems, and even though it is present in very less quantity, it has a huge impact on the global warming potential, and it is also emitted during magnesium production. And nowadays these electrical transmission systems are getting replaced with either vacuum circuit breakers or relays in order to avoid the SF6 in the transmission system. Now coming to NF3, it is nitrogen trifluoride, so which is emitted from solar panel manufacturing and LCD manufacturing, etc. So if we look at the global warming potential, here what we take into consideration is the ability of the gas, as I told, the ability of the gas to retain heat and also the lifetime of the gas. So here when we talk about these greenhouse gases, we take carbon dioxide as the reference value. So for example, here if we take the global warming potential, suppose if you take example of 1 kg of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, then you look at methane. If 1 kg of methane is emitted into the atmosphere, it is equivalent to 28 times the CO2. So this would be used for us to convert the calculation of all other gases into carbon dioxide equivalent. That is where we use the global warming potential. Now looking at, for example, sulfur hexafluoride. So its global warming potential is 23,900 times, so close to 24,000. So from this, what we could say is, even if 1 kg of SF6 is being emitted into the atmosphere, it is equivalent to 24,000 times the carbon dioxide. So this is how we use the global warming potential, and this is one of the main concept what we would use for conversion of all the other 6 gases into carbon dioxide equivalent. So now looking at the Canada's commitment, so you would have heard of the Paris Agreement, which says that we should limit the global warming temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So globally, that is a commitment taken by almost all the countries. Now Canada has given its commitment that it would go net zero by 2050, and it has an interim commitment as well, which says that it would reduce its emissions by 40 to 45% by from the 2005 levels by the year 2030. So this is the Canada's commitment. So coming to Alberta, if we look at the carbon pricing or the carbon taxes, presently what is happening, it also shows that the study shows that right now we are paying close to 65 to 75 dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent emitted. So it would be rising by at least $15 each year, and it would reach around $170 per ton of CO2 equivalent in 2030. So in order to avoid this, it is mostly like we would be paying a penalty kind of thing for the carbon that we are emitting into the atmosphere. So in order to reduce the costs, or to pay less penalty, or to eradicate it totally or mitigate it, what we could do is look at the sustainability practices and look at reducing our emissions in order to avoid the carbon taxes. So as we have seen, so there is a global commitment for which each country has to work towards it. Then when we talk about country, it is the industries and the sectors in each country which have to contribute towards that. Then in each sector, again, each organization has to contribute. And finally, it boils down to the individual contribution, which would be helpful to attain or reach these targets or goals. So for Calgary also we have a climate implementation strategy. So it mostly aligns with the Canada's commitment. And by 2030, the city of Calgary would have committed to reduce 40 to 45% of its emissions and go net zero by 2050. So from now we will talk about the GHG protocol and how could it be classified under scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, which is the main concept for inventorization and also the GHG accounting methodology. So are there any questions still here or should I continue? Okay, now if we look at what is required to start a business. So firstly, we would require some land, then infrastructure, then we need employees, manpower. So these are the basic things. Apart from financials, these are the basic things we look at in order to start a business. So here the box you see, let's consider it to be a land. Now when we talk about infrastructure, so for the equipment to work we need electricity. So there would be some transmission system, so where we could get the electricity. Now once this is there, so we look at all the equipment. So we purchase all the equipment like DG sets, then the process lines, all the equipment in the process lines, then boilers in case of any captive consumption and all. Then looking at some equipment such as welding, gas, then CO2 extinguishers, HVAC systems, etc. Now this is within the boundary. So here if we consider the box to be land, we consider it and assume it to be the physical boundary. Now then we look at manpower, then also the transport and distribution of the goods and services, so transport of raw materials as well, then yeah, manpower. So finally looking at the finished goods which would be transported and distributed to the stores or to the clientele, and for some of the transportation for that as well. And finally business travel. So all these are some of the operations that take place for an organization or a business to run. So now when we are talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, so firstly it is the classification of emissions under direct and indirect. So the criteria that we look at is when the emissions happen within a physical boundary and which is controlled by the company itself, we call it as the uh, direct emissions. Suppose if the emissions take place outside the physical boundary of the company or the business, then we consider it to be indirect emissions. So now when we talk about the direct emissions, we call them as scope 1 emissions. Now going to indirect emissions, under indirect emissions the classification is for scope 2 and scope 3. So when we talk about scope 2, it is mostly electricity or heat which is generated somewhere else, but we use it and we have control over the usage of it. So we consider that to be scope 2. Coming to scope 3, this is mostly the third party services where we don't have any control on the emissions from those operations. So all those would be categorized under scope 3. And most of this happens beyond the physical boundary of a organization. So that is also the criteria which we look at. So these are the scope 3 emissions. So scope 2 and scope 3. So just to give you a summary of what all operations would be under scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. So these are the 7 gases GHG which are under the greenhouse gases classification. Now coming to scope 1, it is the company facilities and the so these are the company facilities which are owned and controlled by the company and which is within the physical boundary of the company, and also company vehicles. So these travel outside the physical boundary, however they are controlled by the company operations. So those would be classified under scope 1 emissions. Now coming to scope 2, it is purchased energy, heating or cooling, and purchased steam, mostly for the electricity and heat energy requirement if we are purchasing from some other company, then we call them as the scope 2 emissions. Now coming to scope 3, so we purchase capital goods, that is the infrastructure required for the operations, then transportation and distribution. So here we can talk about procurement of the raw materials, that would come under scope 3 emissions. Then fuel or energy. Suppose if we take a cement plant and there is a power plant in it. So for that you would require either gas or coal. So again, transporting of coal from coal mines to the point of usage would also incur some transportation emissions. So that would be considered under the scope 3 emissions. Then waste generated from the operations and the quantity of waste that goes into the landfill, as methane would be emitted from the landfill. So those would be considered under scope 3. Then looking at the business travel. So for business travel, we account it to be the emissions from either any kind of or any mode of transport like flights or train or bus. So we consider them to be under business travel. Then purchase goods or services. Any type of purchase goods or services. For example, if you use paper for printing in as one of the operations, then the emissions from paper, from production of paper, would be counted under the purchase goods and services under scope 3. Then employee commute. So how employees commute to office, if they are using their own car, carpooling, or any kind of public transport. So those also would be accounted under employee commute for the scope 3 emissions. Then finally, leased assets. If we talk about any leased assets which are directly related to the company, so they come under scope 3. Suppose if there are warehouses, so the consumption or the emissions from those leased assets would be under scope 3 for the company. Then looking at the transportation and distribution. So these are the downstream activities. So which talks about the final good, which is either transported or distributed. Either it is sent to a store or directly to the client. So that would be under the transportation and distribution. Then looking at processing of sold product. For example, if you take a steel company, so it manufactures steel rods. Further, the steel rod would be again processed in order to become a gear rod in an automobile or a car. So that processing of the sold product, so whatever the emissions occur from processing of this steel rod to a gear rod, all these emissions should be accounted by this company under scope 3. Then use of sold products. For example, if you take any of the appliances like a bulb or refrigerator, microwave. So here the use of sold products. So whatever they consume, the energy they consume in their lifetime should be accounted under scope 3 for use of sold products. The main intent here to keep this use of sold products is to make the companies be more aware of energy efficiency and use quality products, so that the energy efficiency can be looked at while using such products, and it wouldn't consume more energy. Then talking about leased facilities, so same like the warehouses. Then looking at investments. So suppose investments is mostly related to the financial institution. Suppose if a bank invests in any of the companies or the organizations, so the percentage investment done by the bank will be equivalent to the percentage of emissions it should consider under its scope 3. Now coming to franchises. So if suppose Tim Hortons or McDonald's, so as they have franchises and if they are doing their GHG accounting, then it has to consider all of its franchises and the emissions from its franchises. Finally, end of life treatment. So is it getting recycled or again going into landfill? So even that would be considered under the downstream activities under scope 3. So till here, do you have any doubts? So we can get into the classification. Okay. Now, if we look at some of the emission sources, so identify them. So firstly, we have to look at, is there any fossil fuel combustion in the premises of the organization? If yes, then it goes under scope 1. Then looking at electricity and heat consumption, yes, as we have electricity consumption, so it goes under scope 2. transportation and distribution of goods, then use of sold products, end of life treatment. So these mostly go on to the scope 3. Now, getting into the data collection. Now we know what is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Then we look at what are the sources that we have identified, and from that, how are we going to collect data? So for that, the examples of activity data would be if the fuel is consumed, fossil fuel, then how many liters or kgs of gas, or in gigajoules we can look at. Then electricity consumed, how many units of electricity is consumed. If suppose coal or something is consumed, how many kgs, that is the material consumed. Then distance traveled in kilometers for the transportation purposes by trucks or cars. Then a time operated, like how many hours has that been operated. Then waste generated, product sold. So all these things we can look at for as the activity data, for which we need data to do the multiplication and get the final results. So here if you see, this is a sample electricity bill. So in electricity bill, where to collect the activity data is what is the use, how many units have been used for a particular time period. Then that shows that this is the activity data of the electricity consumption for 1 month. So when we talk about data selection, we have to look at the major factors such as technological representativeness. Are we covering all types of technologies which are being used in the organization? Then looking at temporal representativeness, which means that it is the time consideration that we take into account. So mostly GHG calculations and all are done on yearly basis. So we have to look at all the months, data from all the months, and then do it for the yearly basis. Then geographical representativeness. So we have to look at what are all the units at different places, at different geographies, have all that been covered. This would be mostly used for the corporate level GHG accounting. So all of them should be covered. So as we have talked about franchises, it is like in all the geographies, the franchises should be taken into account and the data has to be covered. And completeness and reliability of the data. So none of the data should be left. It is like almost, for example, if you look at the SBT targets, which are science-based targets, in that methodology also they say that 95% of all the emission sources should be covered under scope 1 and scope 2. So we need to look at the complete data as a whole picture. And reliability. So from where are we collecting the data? Is it from the receipts or from the logbooks? So we need to be sure of that we are collecting data from an authentic source. So companies can use like two types of data. One is primary data and the secondary data. So what we have discussed till now is mostly the primary data that is available with the organization in any of the form, from the receipts or the logbooks, etc. If suppose some of the data is not available, then we consider the industry average, take an average of that value and do the calculations. So many companies use a combination of both primary and secondary. So primary data would be used mostly for scope 1 and scope 2 because it would be within the control of the organization. And coming to the secondary data, it would be used for scope 3 because the data might not be available with you directly. The suppliers might have the data or might not have the data. So then the industry average can be taken into account and the secondary data can be used over there. So coming to the emission calculation, so we have discussed about activity data. So example is liters of fuel consumed. Then we have discussed about the emission factor. So now coming to the emission factor, it is mostly given by the organizations such as IPCC, or there are certain publications which gives the emission factors. Here what it means is for 1 kg of fuel consumed, how much quantity of CO2 would be CO2 equivalent would be released into the atmosphere. So that is the emission factor. And then the global warming potential, which we have discussed. So multiplying all these, we would finally get the emissions in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent. So this is the final result, and this is the value that would be published in all the annual reports and also the sustainability reports of the company, saying that this is the quantity of tons of CO2 equivalent emissions which has been emitted for a particular year. Yeah, Now, if we talk about the concept of tons of CO2 equivalent, it is called as the absolute emission. And if we divide it with the reference such as quantity of cement produced or number of automobiles produced or cars produced, that would come under emission intensity. So when we talk about the concept of net zero, we consider the absolute emissions, and our aim is to reduce those emissions to almost zero. So that is the concept of net zero. So here, this is the GHG emission. So you have done your GHG accounting, and these are the results which shows the tons of CO2 equivalent. Now what we have to do is reduce that. So it is impossible to make to bring those emissions to zero. However, we can implement certain strategies to reduce the emissions to the maximum possibility. So that is the optimal operation that we can do. Then we can look at the carbon offsets such as carbon credits, either biological sequestration or technological sequestration, which gives a net zero. So for net zero, the first step is going towards GHG accounting, which we have discussed. Then once the GHG accounting is done and you have the certain number, you would get a picture of what are your emissions for a particular year. Then you can work on the implementation strategies such as energy efficiency, so which would reduce your electricity emissions. Then looking at renewable energy, so substituting the conventional energy with renewable energy. Then looking at other things such as carbon sequestration, so you could go with carbon offsets, carbon credits to make the emissions zero. Then also few concepts such as carbon pricing, carbon labeling, and science-based targets can also be used. So coming to carbon pricing, it is mostly the carbon taxes which we discussed about. And coming to carbon labeling, nowadays companies are also giving a tag. For example, Nike, Adidas, all these companies have come out with a carbon labeling system, which tells that this is the like 3 to 4 kg of CO2 equivalent has been emitted for manufacturing of this pair of shoes. So which keeps the consumer informed about that, and this would help the consumers to make a better choice if they are looking at reducing the environmental impact all by themselves. So they could make a conscious decision as well. Now looking at the mitigation strategies, these are the broad mitigation strategies, but however we can tailor it to a company basis based on their operations. So one is looking at energy efficiency, so getting the energy audits done in a regular intervals, so that the energy cost would also come down. Then looking at renewable energy, for example, on-site solar panel installation or small wind turbine in micro turbine or wind turbine at a smaller capacity installation, that would reduce the both the emissions and also the electricity consumption. Then collaborating with the partners or the suppliers, or partnering with the suppliers to reduce and helping them also to reduce their emissions, because it is indirectly proportionate to the scope 3 emissions of yours. Then looking at green freight, so shipping, if it is not very urgent and if you could plan it in advance, you can go with the shipment through sea. Then looking at electric vehicles as well. Then employee commute and business travel, so creating certain incentives for employee commute, so who are using public transport or carpooling, or having 1 day a week as a carpooling day, so that the emissions could be reduced. And also looking at the green building practices. So these are few of the mitigation strategies. When we talk about green building practices, it is like motion sensors, so the energy consumption could be reduced. Now looking at the incentive programs, there is a program by Alberta government, by Emission Reduction Alberta, which is giving certain incentives for various categories, like motors and drives, compressed air, refrigeration, on-site generation. So you could apply for that and avail those benefits or the incentives in order to implement the goals that you have for reducing the emissions. Then one more is by the federal government, which has an incentive of close to $5,000 for purchase of an electric vehicle. This could be used for your transport as well. And this is the website which gives the details about this program. Now, just looking at few myths, they say that SMEs don't contribute much to GHG emissions, but it is that in Canada, the mostly more than 90% of the businesses are SMEs, so they contribute huge. And looking at the SMEs can do much to reduce the emissions. SMEs can actually, it is easy also for SMEs to look at their operations and to reduce the GHG emissions. Then can make difference on their own. So collaboratively, all the SMEs can reduce the emissions to a larger extent, and also green initiatives are too expensive for SMEs. So once we get into the mode of sustainability practices and looking at green initiatives, SMEs could realize that it is not expensive at all, and they would be able to even save more uh, by implementing the green initiatives. And also consumers are not interested in sustainability practices, so nowadays consumers are also aware of their purchases and how they are making the conscious decisions in order to reduce the climate change effects. Now looking at the benefits, so as I already mentioned, it is to reduce the operational costs such as energy costs, carbon tax, then savings. So when you implement certain strategies, looking at the energy efficiency, suppose if you are replacing your existing CFL bulb with a LED bulb, then investment would be there at the upfront, but however if you look at the payback or return on investment, you will realize that you would get the return on investment within less than 2 years timeline. So beyond that, that would be the savings for you. Then capital goods, looking at the greener products and waste reduction, segregation, and also recycling. So it would be a double benefit where we reduce our energy costs and the operational costs, and the carbon tax, you need not pay the carbon tax with the single measure of looking at GHG accounting and setting goals and reducing the emissions. So this would also be looked by the investors and the banks. So as I've mentioned, the scope 3 emissions have investments to be calculated. So banks are also cautious and the investors are also cautious on where they are investing their money. So that their scope 3 emissions would be reduced, and they would also be looking at the businesses which emit less and pollute the environment less. So this would also be helpful for gaining the reputation which says that you are responsible, so which could be used for marketing, could stand ahead of the competition, and also have certain financial benefits. So this is a survey conducted, so which shows that which shows that the consumers are looking at sustainable and ethical practices. So as we are working on this project, so we have collaborated with close to 10 small and medium businesses in Calgary, and we have supported them in collecting data, and we normally work on the data and customize a tool based on the operations of each business, and we have come out with the dashboard as well. So this is the dashboard which shows the comparison between the years and how are they able to reduce. So this helps them to check their progress on the targets or the timelines that they have committed, and this would be mostly the customized tool which could be used by each company, and this could be used for the subsequent years as well. So if anyone is interested to go ahead with the GHG accounting, so we would be able to help the companies and support the companies in creating this customized dashboard, so which would be done by us, and this tool would be submitted to them at the end of the project, and this can be used by the companies in order to see their progress and where they are standing in terms of achieving their targets. and they also can keep a track of how the implementation strategies are helping them in order to reduce their emissions. So if anybody is interested, please feel free to contact us, and this would be done at free of cost for any company which is in and around Calgary. So this is a website of Eco Canada, I mean, which is in the Eco Canada's website. So you can look at all the resources. There is a toolkit which helps the companies to understand their GHG accounting, and also the patterns, and also based on the implementation strategies. So based on our experience of working with these small and medium companies, the pilot companies, we have worked with around 10 of them. So we are releasing the implementation strategies as well, which could be used by you, and it would be available in the website. So after this, we have three more webinars in this series, which talks about the implementation strategies in detail, mostly focusing on the supply chain management, or how to work with your suppliers, then looking at what are the risks and opportunities, then finally the carbon markets. So these are coming up. So we would request you to register for those webinars as well and join those webinars. So if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Yeah, there is a question like what other references can we use for CO2 emission factors? So for example, as I'm working on this businesses with Calgary, so I look at the published reports of Alberta. So where their emissions have been reported. So it is better to look at the authenticated publications or the sources to get the emission factors. Yes, the pilot project with the, I mean, the small and medium businesses on which we are working as pilots, they are from different sectors. So some of them are into services, some of them are into manufacturing, and even some of them are into like the restaurant businesses as well, some coffee shops. So we are working with different sectors. how do we split or allocate GHG between a supplier and its customers with scope 3 transport and distribution? Yeah, so here what happens is this leads to a concept of double accounting. So we can look at the control. So suppose if it is by them. So for example, if we take a transporting company, let's say that a truck is being used for transporting some of our goods. So here it might be 100% of the truck emissions can be ours because we are sending all the goods, like the full truck goods are from the same company, or it can be half and half or any percentage over there. Then we can consider that percentage of emissions to be accounted to this company and the second one to that. So here what happens is the transport and distribution companies scope 1 and scope 2 would be different. So when we add those two, scope 1 and scope 2, that would be accounted to our scope 3 emissions. So we can discuss on this with the supplier as well and look at how much percentage. Suppose if the supplier has said that they have emitted around 100 tons of CO2 equivalent in that year and they have done business with us as well. So we can see how much percentage of the business that we have given to them is contributing to those emissions, and we can account it under our scope 3. Yeah, the ESG metric is applied in your calculation. Can you be a little clear on what the ESG metric you are talking about? Suppose if you are talking about the environment part in the ESG reporting structure, yes, then we consider the GHG accounting to be under the ESG metric. So I think these are the questions. So thank you for attending, and you can look at the Eco Canada website, and even this presentation would be shared with you. So and as well as the recording, so you can access it over there. Thank you.